Tantor Audio, a division of recorded books, presents Z Generation, Into the Heart of Russia's Fascist Youth, by Garner. Narrated by Daniel Henning. 1. God is with our boys. Fuck those Ukraine Nazi scum. God is with our boys. Kill the fags. Don't sell out the motherland, bitch. Treacherous scum, die. 19-year-old Alina is from Nizhny Tagil, a rather unwelcoming and rapidly shrinking post-Soviet city, best known for its iron ore industry and for producing Soviet tanks. By Russian standards, she's had a fortunate upbringing. Her father is a senior accountant in a local business making good money, so she's been able to travel widely. She covets her iPhone and her MacBook, and she loves to get her hands on the latest designer clothes on her annual 2,000-mile round trip to Moscow. When she's not studying for her degree in graphic design, Alina does all the things anyone else of her age might. She hangs out with her boyfriend, Sergei, who works in a local mechanic shop. They and their friends watch the latest Hollywood blockbusters at the local cinema, which are today being pirated into the Russian market or played as second billing after a cheap domestic production. Anna's friends are, they say, sick of the boring domestic productions, which are usually cheap romance and state-funded World War II epics. They downed fearsome quantities of alcohol in local bars, but inspired by the minimalist aesthetic of Instagram influencers, they also wish they drank less and are perpetually on the brink of embracing a clean living lifestyle. They love to go on long walks, the great Russian progulka, fueled by beer and cigarettes galore in the short summer months when temperatures are known to reach into the scorching high 30s. When she graduates, Alina dreams of ditching Nizhny Tagil's disintegrating Soviet-era architecture for the bright lights of Moscow with Sergei. She has her sights set on a job in the capital's up-and-coming high-tech industry. Alina, like most young people in Russia, is addicted to her smartphone. She's uploaded all the trappings of ordinary millennial life to her page on VK, the Russian Facebook, used regularly by over 70 million Russian citizens. She shows off photos of trips to Egypt, relaxing on the beach, taking dips in soothing still pools, and to Sochi, the Black Sea resort that hosted the Winter Olympics in 2014, just before Vladimir Putin's army seized Crimea from Ukraine. She shares videos about nail design, fashion, and movies and TV. Alina's a big fan of Maisie Williams' Game of Thrones character, who is, in her words, a fierce role model of modern womanhood. But since the 24th of February, 2022, when Russia unfroze the conflict in eastern Ukraine, it had started in 2014 by sending an invasion force into the country, Alina's VK page has become a different world. The fripperies of consumerist life have been submerged. Like hundreds of thousands of other Russians, Alina has joined dozens of government-run and promoted or astroturfed groups with names like Real Ukraine, Anti-Terror Z, Z for Victory, the Russian Spring, and Strength in Truth. Whether holed up in a bedroom still adorned with the accoutrement of teen life, gaudy posters plastered over drab, flowery wallpaper, cosmetic tubs scattered over the table, framed photos of friends lining bookshelves, or whether posting from class, from the backseat of a bus, or from a bar while chatting with her friends, Alina's thirst for liking, commenting on, and sharing the world of Russia's war against Ukraine seems unquenchable. Alina began by sharing posts directly from the groups she had joined. In this conspiracy-fueled world, new truths about depraved Ukrainian neo-Nazis are uncovered every day. Russia is under constant threat from shadowy forces led by NATO and the American government, and Ukraine has to be destroyed to save itself, and Russians, from a spectral Nazi threat. Alina's VK wall is packed with apocalyptic images of a burning White House in Washington, D.C., of the Ukrainian flag, the devil's swastika, of Orthodox priests and saints blessing the troops at the Ukrainian front, and of Putin as a savior. In this reality, a sacred Russia is surrounded by enemies bent on its total obliteration. As the war in Ukraine has unfolded, Alina has begun to improvise. She riffs on the themes and language of these frightening social media communities in skittish, tempestuous remarks. Chochols, a derogatory term for Ukrainians, are assholes. The white of our Russian flag means cleanliness. Ukro-fascists are rabid dogs. If I was in charge, you fuckers would get what you deserve. Ukrainians better not talk in Ukrainian, it just sounds stupid, like fucked up Russian. Putin, Alina posts, is a gift from God. We are all Putin. Alina's life before the invasion could have belonged to any American or European teenager who loved their phone and fancied big city life over provincial tedium. No longer. The talk of cleanliness, the language of dehumanization, the mockery. Alina is not merely parodying the propaganda of her own government and the social media groups she has joined. She has learned to speak a language of violence, a language of Russian fascism. Alina is not alone. Thousands of Russians are today participating in this public display of hatred and warmongering on the Runet, the Russian-language internet, which has its own social networks, search engines, blogging sites, and food delivery, ride-hailing, and shopping apps. Young Russian internet users flaunt their rage and drive each other into an anti-Ukrainian frenzy as news of, or rather conspiracies about, the war consumes every part of Russian society. Ukrainians are attacked as subhuman. The latest government conspiracy about Western evil is repeated ad nauseum to millions of social media users. Putin and God are praised for leading Russia into Ukraine to drive out and destroy the fascist threat, and dead young troops are lauded as saintly martyrs. How did Alina, a seemingly westernized, Hollywood-loving, and carefree teen with dreams of a modern career in the buzzing and cosmopolitan hub of Moscow, turn into an online fascist, seemingly overnight? Does she believe a word of what she writes? Or is it all for show? Who is she writing for? And what next for Russia and for the world if a generation of furious fascist Alinas grows up to take charge of the world's biggest nuclear power? Invasion and purification. By early 2022, Russia had amassed almost 200,000 soldiers on its border with eastern Ukraine, over 1,000 miles from Alina's home in Nizhny Tagil. The government was ready to dramatically intervene in a conflict that had roiled away since 2014, when Moscow seized Crimea and established separatist regimes in Donetsk and Luhansk in the east of Ukraine. During the night of the 24th of February, Putin addressed the nation. Speaking from a regal wood-paneled office deep in the Kremlin, he claimed that Russia was obliged to launch a special military operation, a phrase that sounds as hollow in Russian as in English, in Ukraine. The president reeled off a series of ahistorical and illogical justifications for his decision. The operation would defend Ukrainians from the humiliation and genocide perpetrated by the Kyiv regime. Russia would not impose anything by force. It only sought to ensure freedom from a supposedly Nazi regime in Kyiv. Putin called on the Russian people to recognize their ancestors' sacrifices in World War II, when 25 million Soviets died fighting Hitler's armies, and to fight for their ancestors' culture, values, experiences, and traditions. Putin concluded on a spiritually infused note of hope. I believe in your support and in the invincible force that gives us our love for the fatherland. This was a war of belief, of faith. In Russian, the two words share a single root. The invading forces were beset by logistical disasters, mass casualties, and a failure to reach their goal of rapidly overwhelming Kyiv. Nonetheless, infantry and artillery set about brutalizing the enemy. Bustling cities like Mariupol were razed. Civilians were deliberately targeted with rocket fire and bombing raids. In early April, when Ukrainian troops drove the occupiers away from Kyiv, they began to unearth evidence of the most shocking atrocities seen on European soil since the Yugoslav wars. Russian soldiers had run riot, torturing, murdering, and raping innocent civilians. Since then, the discoveries of mass graves and torture sites have kept coming. At home, the government's allies in the media and the Orthodox Church went on their own 24/7 offensive. Foghorn opinion makers advocated for nuclear attacks on the West, invading the Baltic states, and claimed that Ukrainian Nazis were responsible for historical crimes from World War II to the present. Images of children supposedly killed by Ukrainian armed forces and rescued by Russia's allied forces, the allies being the occupied territories of Donetsk and Luhansk, flooded social media. Everyone from Ukraine to Britain, Canada, the United States, Poland, Japan, Sweden, Finland, NGOs, and most absurdly of all, Israel, was labeled a Nazi-loving terror supporter. Calls to commit genocide and descriptions of threats to Russia were delivered in a language of macho, misogynistic, and homophobic hatred. Russia's enemies are faggots, women, pussies, or blacks, and niggers. Ukrainians are subjected to torrents of abuse that echo the language of Nazism. They are diseased, beasts, monsters, animals, and worst of all, Niludi, unpeople. Why poison a handful of cockroaches with sarin when there are a host of simpler and cheaper ways to do it? Asked one popular journalist and blogger after Russia was accused of using chemical weapons in Ukraine. Ever un-Christian, the Russian Orthodox Church does nothing to discourage violent behavior. Its leader, Patriarch Kirill, instead blesses the army from the pulpit of the Cathedral of the Armed Forces in Moscow, a state-funded megachurch that hosts military exhibitions and opened on Victory Day in 2020, the state's annual pageant in memory of the end of World War II. Religion is so totally at one with the state of 2022 that commentators assert that the Russian Patriarch believes in Putin instead of believing in God. Users on the social media network Telegram, a WhatsApp-like messaging app favored for the news and discussion channels its users can join, and on Alina's beloved VK, were hooked. Rape, torture, and violent fantasies encouraged by the state, the media, and the church, the unholy trinity of power in today's Russia, were in turn made reality at the front. The regime simultaneously moved to close off the Russian public's access to outside information and to shut them up when they dared to deviate from the state's propaganda lines. The few remaining independent news outlets, like the liberal radio station Echo of Moscow and the independent TV Rain, were shut down. Journalists, even the Nobel Prize-winning Dmitry Muratov, were publicly assaulted by heavies and hooligans. The hugely popular Instagram and Facebook were blocked, even if tech-savvy young Russians easily skirted the government's restrictions. The draconian new law forbade spreading fake news about the Russian army, threatening citizens with up to 15 years in jail or up to 1.5 million rubles, over 20 times the monthly average salary of just under 58,000 rubles, in fines. Russian audiences were enraptured and shocked. Some young Russians took to the streets in protest, leading to the arrest of 15,000 citizens by Putin's security forces in the 3 weeks after the declaration of war. isolated absurdist demonstrations against the government's policies, students covered in fake blood popping up outside universities or holding blank protest signs on Moscow's Red Square, went viral in the West, but were mostly ignored in Russia. A trickle of celebrities spoke out. Unexpected voices of reason, like Ivan Urgant, the host of a long-running and hugely popular Jimmy Kimmel-esque late-night chat show on state TV, rapidly found themselves out of a job and out of the country, fleeing to Israel, Cyprus, and beyond. Familiar thorns in the regime's side, young celebrities like the outspoken rapper Alisher Morgenstern, and YouTubers like Yuri Dud, who makes confrontational documentaries about state corruption and authoritarianism for his millions of subscribers, rapidly found themselves classed as foreign agents, a tag that comes with sweeping legal restrictions. These famous enemies of the state were castigated by politicians, propagandists, and priests in a blaze of public criticism. And it wasn't just famous Russians voting with their feet. An estimated 200,000 Russians left the country within weeks, taking advantage of favorable visa regimes to decamp to former Soviet countries with large Russian-speaking populations like Georgia, Armenia, and Kazakhstan. The lucky few with connections, money, and the right visas made it to the Baltic states, or further afield in Europe. But the protest movement fizzled out as quickly as it flared up. By late March, its public face was effectively dead. A handful of celebrities slowly announced their anti-war views, and a trickle of Russians continued to leave the country, which turned into a brief flood when the state announced mandatory recruitment in late September. But the opposition overall retreated and fell silent. Russia may be famed for centuries of dissidents, from the poet Alexander Pushkin to Lenin, Andrei Sakharov, and Alexei Navalny, but its opposition has never been so browbeaten. Something alarming had cracked open in Russian society. Putin's justification for the invasion may have been flimsy, and the propaganda flood of discoveries of Ukrainian COVID biolabs, plots to build nuclear weapons, and conspiracies spanning everything from rural American colleges to Kyiv veterinary clinics absurd. But most Russians, to some extent, professed support for the war. According to opinion polls, albeit of shaky reliability, up to 70 to 80%, and over half of the 18 to 25 demographic supported the special operation. Indeed, for all the celebrities who left, there were equal numbers promoting the war. Alexander Ovechkin, the national sporting hero and Washington Capitals hockey captain, traveled to Moscow to meet a pro-Putin youth leader. The rap mogul Timothy, Russia's answer to Jay-Z, who owns everything from record labels to burger joints and who has close ties to the Kremlin, claimed that the world wants another Gorbachev or Yeltsin, supposedly weak anti-Russian leaders, but history has other plans. Roma Zealous, a photogenic young YouTube singer turned all-purpose celebrity, railed against Western support for Ukraine on his Instagram feed. Go Russia! I'm for world peace. The hatred and calls to kill Russians made by those you support have shown us your true face. A language of violence began to trample the shoots of anti-war protest. In April, Western publics were rocked by the discovery of mass murders in the Kyiv suburb of Bucha. Images of corpses, their hands tied and their eyes blindfolded, discarded in the streets, of mutilated bodies, of torture chambers in cellars and schools, shocked the world. The Russian government went into overdrive to produce a narrative that promised the footage was faked, that it was a Western provocation, that perhaps there were no bodies at all, or that Ukrainian and shadowy Western forces had committed mass murder to fit the good and honest Russian army up. Some Russians bought none of it. But plenty more found their voice on the nationalist social media channels, where they almost chided their country's army for showing mercy to the enemy. Hundreds of users left comments. "These unpeople, vermin, and diseased Ukrainians deserve to die. We've got to kill these fuckers," said one user. Alina joined in the frenzy. "Bucha! I'll create another Bucha! I'll teach them!" She does not merely deny atrocities committed by Russia. She embraces them. Alina even promises that she would like to take part in a genocide against two of the state's enemies, Ukrainians and homosexuals, at home. "Yukis, come have a gay pride parade in Tagil. We'll turn it into a meat grinder." Meat grinder is a favorite Russian synonym for a trial by torture, a bloodbath of the sort the Soviets had to live through in World War II. Now, supposedly ethnic Russians, Russian speakers Putin's state claims to defend, are fed through another meat grinder by their enemies. Alina lumps all of Russia's enemies into one basket. Ukrainians, homosexuals, and Nazis are all synonymously not Russian. Therefore, they are both evil and undesirable. Prompted by the state, its propagandists, a whole host of famous faces, and a vast web of social media groups, Russians like Alina encouraged Russian troops to behave in the most abhorrent ways as they rampaged through occupied Ukrainian towns. The soldiers transgressed, and swaths, not all, but at least a sizable minority, of the public didn't just applaud. Like Alina, they egged them on, relishing their status as the Western media's bad guys. The worse the atrocity, the more the public proclaimed that #we aren't ashamed, nam nie stydno. They believed in their crusade. They believed they were purifying Russia, a country that exists wherever Moscow has once reigned and wherever Russian is spoken. Alina's path is not the only one today's Russians are taking. Yet young Russians on the other side of the divide are more afraid than ever before to speak out. I sent dozens of emails to contacts and old friends. Even my most trusted contacts didn't want to open up. "Sveta, hey, long time no speak. I hope you're doing well. Listen up, I'm writing about young people in Russia. I know you're probably busy, but can I chat to you about it? I'd love to get your thoughts on what it's like teaching kids right now." The ping is almost instantaneous. Sveta writes back with the same response I've seen so many times already. "That's so cool. It's lovely to hear from you. Everything in our country is complicated right now, so I can't help. Best, Sveta." Complicated. A word that said more than any lengthy political discussion. Sveta, who's now a schoolteacher in her early 30s, was never one to keep quiet. We used to hang out in a more hopeful St. Petersburg, the canal-filled northern Venice that for many Russians embodies the nation's links to European culture and power, in the late 2000s. Sveta loved the West, but she also loved her country. She spoke great English, but she always wanted to show off the real Russia. She'd take me on tours of the city's Baroque architecture, lead me through its canals and boulevards, shepherd me off on the subway to its far-flung modern outskirts, and invite me to family gatherings. Sveta loved hot indie bands from Britain and the States, but she never thought of leaving the country. For Sveta and many of her generation, St. Petersburg, and Russia with it, had been drifting inexorably towards its European destiny in the 2000s. That meant cultural belonging, political calm, liberal values, and economic prosperity. But in 2022, even Sveta didn't want to talk about what was going on. Something in her curt response, she'd totally brushed me off, was new. A curtain is again descending between Russia and the West. The old Europeanizing values of Russians' young people seem to be disappearing as the revanchism, paranoia, and aggression of Alina's VK feed and Putin's speeches come to the fore. On the 16th of March, Putin appeared again on television to address the nation. Russia, he claimed, was threatened not just by forces from the outside, but by fifth columnists who had to be cleansed. The state media claimed spies and enemies were everywhere and always working on behalf of a shadowy cabal of forces that included globalists, America, and Ukraine. Television depicted these so-called spies being violently arrested. Front doors were shattered with battering rams, car doors torn open, and bodies thrown onto sidewalks and stairwells. The faces of confused young men were smashed into the ground as thuggish security personnel screamed abuse into their ears. Images of supposed traitors' front doors, daubed with graffiti. "Traitor to the motherland! Don't sell out your country, bitch!" spread widely online. They were celebrated in nationalist groups and received with funereal silence by stunned liberals. A few days after she knocked me back, Sveta cracked. She and her colleagues at the public school in St. Petersburg, where she had worked for the last half-decade, uploaded images of themselves fanned out in the shape of a Z, the symbol of support for the war, to VK. Clad in dark gray overcoats that shielded them from the gloomy damp of Petersburg's early spring, the group in the photograph was almost imperceptible against the disintegrating gray asphalt of the Soviet-era schoolyard. Sveta was on the edge of the shot, limply waving a Russian flag. Many average Russians with average salaries, regular dreams and ambitions, and no funding or special incentive from the government have been persuaded that Ukraine is such a great threat that the nation and its population may have to be sacrificed in order to cleanse Russia. They participate in the state's propaganda projects, offering up the limpest of protestations before caving in. This phenomenon is not new in Russia. In the Soviet Union, the most ordinary people were frequently the regime's most enthusiastic supporters, embracing its symbolism and language to construct their own identity. Not every Russian today is following Alina's path to extremism, but even those who claim apathy are being constantly exposed to the extremists' world. Young Russian zealots like Alina are, however, something new in the post-Soviet space. For Alina, publicly performing aggressive nationalist language, sharing conspiratorial memes, and demonstrating support for the Ukraine war is heartfelt. For her, Russia deserves to be a great nation. It is surrounded by threats. Western movies and TV are rapidly losing their appeal as she spots ever more terrifying conspiracies hidden within the Trojan horse of American culture. She and everyone younger than her may only ever know a Russia almost completely cut off from the West. A Russia driven by messianic, apocalyptic, and spiritual goals of Eurasian domination. This is a Russia they want to immerse themselves in, a Russia that promises more profound spiritual rewards than the superficial but dangerous lifestyle of the woke West. This is a fascist Russia. Fascism in the social media age. 2 months before the dissolution of the USSR in December 1991, the former Soviet foreign minister, Eduard Shevardnadze, met a German delegation in Moscow. A perceptive reformer who had often clashed with hardliners in the Communist Party, Shevardnadze warned his German counterparts that in the wake of the USSR's imminent collapse, it would be all too easy for a fascist leader to seize power in Russia and seek Crimea's return to the country's territory. Even Shevardnadze, who would go on to become president of Georgia, could hardly have predicted the pernicious and all-embracing fascist vision that has come to dominate much of Russian public discourse in the first quarter of the 21st century. But what does fascism, a contested term that at its most basic means running an ethno-nationalist state which controls every part of...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?